Hello and welcome to today's lecture. Today we're going to be talking about different conflict styles. So we're going to be focusing on chapter 5 in your textbook. Specifically, in the lecture today, we're going to first identify the 5 different styles. After that, we're going to give you a chance to try and assess what your own particular conflict style or preference is. And we're going to talk about some pros and some cons, or advantages and disadvantages that are associated with each style. We're going to wrap up the video today talking about how sometimes people get stuck using only one type of style and what some strategies might be to avoid that, to become more comfortable using a different type of style. So with that in mind, we'll jump right in and we'll start with this really important graphic. This chart is borrowed directly from your textbook, but if you were to simply Google conflict styles, then you would find some version of this graphic that would likely pop up. The graphic is based on Rahim's identification of 5 different conflict styles. And I like showing the visual instead of just providing you with a bullet point for a couple of reasons. The most important reason is because by looking at the 5 styles in this graphic, we can make some comparisons between each style. Specifically, we can compare the styles based on how they represent one's concern for self and one's concern for other. So if you look at the visual there, you can see that concern for self is the label used on the x-axis. You can see that concern for self goes from low to high. What Rahim is talking about there is, so just how concerned are you about getting your own goals met? In other words, if you were getting ready to engage in a situation, maybe it was something as simple as trying to buy a car and negotiate a price for that car. If you had a very high concern for self, your top priority would be probably to get the lowest price possible. And if you were to the far right on this chart, you would be very concerned with getting that low price, and other things, like for example, perhaps your relationship with that salesperson or what the salesperson thinks about you would probably really not be on your mind. On the other hand, if you were scooted over to the left side of that x-axis, right, and you had low concern for self, then you might be willing to sacrifice some money, right? Or I guess I should say pay a higher price for the car if it meant that maybe you built a good relationship with the salesperson, or the salesperson liked you, or some of those other types of things. So again, I like the chart because it helps us compare the styles. One way that styles are compared is based on how concerned is one with making sure their own personal needs are met versus kind of focusing on relational or identity things. And then on the y-axis, you can see it's labeled concern for others. And again, it kind of varies from low to high as you go up the chart. Concern for others would be if one has a desire to focus on relational goals and is more focused on what others think of us, more so than actually getting your needs met in a certain situation. So as you are hearing this, you can probably think of a variety of situations where your concern for self and where your concern for others might have been at play and might vary depending on the context. With that in mind, I would encourage you to take a quick moment right now and pause the video. And I'm going to ask that, actually, let me advance the slide and then suggest you pause the video. I'm going to ask that you take a few minutes now and you actually go and you do the assessment that is in your textbook and identify your own conflict style. So again, based on this chart, you know that you should have one of the 5 conflict styles kind of surface as your preference. The chart or the survey that you'll need is on page 152 and 153. An important part of filling out this assessment is to make sure that you actually do it twice. And the reason why that's important is, as I just said, we know that sometimes our habits or our behaviors change based on context or based on who we're interacting with. So when you're looking at the chart, you see, or when you're looking at the assessment on page 152, you'll see that it asks you to complete the whole thing thinking about person A. Maybe that's a family member or a sibling. And then it asks you to complete the assessment again, thinking about person B. Maybe that is like a coworker or colleague. So please complete the assessment 2 different times using 2 different specific people. And once you're done with that, there's some directions about how to add up your scores. And then once you've done that, you should see which one of your conflict styles tends to emerge as the highest score. Again, please take a moment, if you haven't already, and pause the video and complete that assessment. This is going to be one of the first things that we do during our next class session. I'm just going to ask everybody, what were your results on this assessment? So it won't work unless everybody comes to class prepared to be able to do that and talk about that. Okay. All right, assuming that you have just paused the video and you have completed your assessment, now we're going to move on and we're going to talk about these styles in a little bit more detail. One thing that I think is important to point out is that as this conflict styles typology has emerged and been used and examined, one criticism has popped up, and that is the argument that maybe it is like too extreme to suggest that the only way to think about the differences between these styles is concern for self or concern for other. Maybe a more appropriate or kind of more neutral way to think about it is to compare the styles based on one's preference for either engaging or avoiding a conflict. Your book gives some good examples of this, but one illustration they point out is, to be honest, one person could use an avoidant conflict style, which based on this chart would suggest you have a low concern for the other person, but perhaps they're actually avoiding a conflict because they actually have a really high concern for the other person's needs. Okay? So maybe it's just too simple to strictly use concern for self and concern for other as our way to make the comparison. So this graphic is trying to point out, as your textbook does, that maybe another way to think about the different styles is compare them in terms of one's preference for engaging in conflict or trying to avoid a conflict. Right? And I'm looking at my slide here, I realize that I have the word engage written, but down below that blank square should say avoid, right? If we are using this specific approach, then you can see the styles of integrating, compromising, and dominating are all ways, are all behaviors that people might use if they have a preference for engaging in conflict, whereas the avoidant and the obliging style would be styles that people have avoidance that would be more likely to use, right? And again, I want to point out that avoidance does not necessarily mean that you don't have concern for other, right? In fact, in some cases, there might be some real good reasons to use an avoidance strategy. There might be some advantages to that, right? Perhaps if you're using it in avoidance, you are actually giving everybody involved time to maybe think of responses and what would be the best thing to do next. Sometimes avoidance can help to avoid escalation. Sometimes not. Sometimes the avoidance is what actually leads to the escalation, but sometimes avoidance can help kind of de-escalate things. Sometimes avoidance can help you maybe avoid being persuaded by one side of the issue or the other. So I think it's important to keep in mind that thinking about the different preferences in terms of not just do you want to look out for your own needs or others' needs, but also to think of the different styles varying and how much you engage or avoid a conflict is valuable. If you find yourself doing things like changing the topic or just simply staying quiet, or kind of refusing to answer to give your own opinion, or maybe just being really vague or abstract. If you're finding yourself doing any one of those things, then probably you are kind of in this preference for avoiding the conflict. Probably you are an obliger or an avoider. Okay, well, anyway, with that point made, let's now actually look at each one of the conflict styles in a little bit more detail. We'll start with this dominating style, right? So again, one way we know we can describe dominating style is that this person tends to prefer to engage in conflict rather than avoid it. Also, at least based on our visual, we know that the dominating style tends to mean the person has a high preference for or concern for getting self needs met, and a low concern for getting the other needs met. Right? Although sometimes I think the dominating style gets a bad rap, sometimes justifiably so. There certainly are some advantages that can come from the dominating style. I've tried to list some of those here. Of course, one of the advantages of dominating style is that it can be very decisive. It can be quick. And in situations where a quick decision needs to be made, that might be really important. We also know that sometimes the dominating style is useful in a situation where the relationship between the two people is not necessarily a top priority. Maybe you will never interact with this person again, but the outcome of the situation, maybe getting the best price, is particularly important. When it comes to the dominating style, we can't talk about it without talking about assertiveness versus aggressiveness. I do think it's important that we make a distinction between being assertive and being aggressive. Being assertive involves making sure to look out for one's own personal needs, but also a concern for managing the face of the other person. Being aggressive refers to someone who is going to get their own needs met at all costs, regardless of how that might impact the other person. So while assertiveness can be a very positive communication style, aggressiveness tends to be perceived much more negatively. With all that in mind, we know that the dominating style, though, does have some potential drawbacks or disadvantages. It is possible that one who consistently relies only on a dominating style may damage some of his or her relationships because they are so prioritizing the goal or the event itself that they may be hurting or damaging the relationship in some way. Right? We also know that sometimes a dominating style can definitely, again, harm relationships and lead to negative impact on some of the goals that we had talked about in previous lectures. Okay, so we've at least got a brief summary of dominating style. So now let's look at compromise. So I think compromise is kind of an interesting style. I think if you were to talk to someone who was not necessarily in this class and you were to ask them, at least someone from like the United States, kind of a Western individualistic culture, if you were to ask someone like that, what is the best way to manage a conflict? My hunch is 9 times out of 10, the answer you would get would be compromise. I'm going to argue that, at least depending on the context, compromise might not necessarily be as an effective approach as we think. Because if you go back and you look at the original chart from the start of this lecture, you can see compromise falls kind of right in the middle of that visual. So although compromise might reflect at least some mid-level concern for getting my goals met, kind of a medium level concern for the other person's goals, we also know compromise comes with having to give up some things, right? Having to concede some things. And in a moment here, we'll see that there are some other styles that don't require that. So compromise can be really great because it can be very quick. It can be very efficient. If time is limited and a decision needs to be made in a hurry, then perhaps compromise is a really good choice. Right? However, as I said earlier, I don't know that it's always the best choice. It's not always as effective as we sometimes give it credit for being. Right? As I just mentioned, a compromise means, for the most part, both parties had to give up or had to lose something. And perhaps if a different style was used, if more creativity and brainstorming was involved, rather than just split the difference, then maybe neither party would have to give up something. Maybe a win-win solution could have been generated instead. So just like dominating, even compromise has some advantages and some disadvantages. Okay. Let's look at our third style here, obliging. When I talk about obliging in my intro to communication class, I compare it to the teddy bear, right? An obliger is kind of like a teddy bear. This person is typically willing to accommodate whoever they're interacting with, And it's not that they're necessarily avoiding a conflict and not getting involved. They're participating in the conversation, but they're kind of giving in. This is the person that's like, oh yeah, I'll just go along with kind of whatever, right? They're like a teddy bear. Again, there can definitely be some situations where an obliging style is appropriate and effective. As you can see in the list of advantages there, someone who uses a obliging style may be perceived as someone who is, very reasonable and is, given credit for being willing to kind of create harmony and to kind of be a team player. Right? On the other hand, however, there certainly can be some disadvantages of obliging, right? And again, you can kind of read through that list. It's a silly, minute example, but I feel like almost every time conflict styles come up and obliging gets discussed, one of the first examples students offer is simply a discussion of when you're with your partner, whether it's a friend or a roommate, and you're talking about where to go to dinner, and the other person just like, I don't care, I'll go wherever you go, I don't care, whatever you want's fine. And it's interesting to me how frustrating that can be to the person telling the story. And so to me, I think that's kind of an illustration of how sometimes the obliging conflict management style, even in a silly situation like that, can be negative. All right, let's move on now to integrating, right? So our integrating style, sometimes also called collaboration, is the style that is kind of thought of as the behaviors that attempts to find win-win solutions to conflict. So unlike compromise, which might be 50-50, the integrating style is an attempt to find 100%, 100%, right? Both parties get what they want if integration or collaboration occurs. Of course, I think it's easy to think of a lot of advantages to an integrating style, right? We know that when people get to have a say in the outcome, then they are much more likely to buy into the outcome. So in this case, if integration and collaboration is used and people feel like they get to participate, then they're going to be much more satisfied with the outcome rather than if someone was kind of dominating the situation and just telling them how things need to be, right? Although, with that being said, we also know that an integrating style is not always easy, that it can take a lot of time and a lot of energy, and some decisions may not need input from everyone. I teach a class in the Masters of Public Administration program right now, and this semester, well, last semester, it was interesting to me how this issue kept coming up, and I think a couple different students were having an issue right now with their managers, where their managers' intent was to be open and to be willing to have conversation and discussion, and kind of explicitly told them that they wanted to make decisions as a group. But the students said, although that was nice at face value and the intent was good, that what that sometimes meant was analysis paralysis. It meant that no decisions got made because they couldn't reach kind of, this agreement where everyone wanted to move in the same direction. So honestly, in those situations, what I heard the students say was they were simply craving their boss to just step in after hearing a little bit input and make the call, right? And assertively make a decision rather than like this kind of constant cyclical conversation. So even integrating, although it can be full of advantages, can have some disadvantages as well. All right, so with all of those conflict styles in mind, it's also important to point out that a lot of times we find ourselves getting stuck using a particular conflict style. And if you kind of look through these questions here, it can help you kind of identify whether or not you are in a kind of a rut or stuck in a conflict style and either unwilling or unable to change depending on the situation. So if you look at these questions and you find yourself the kind of thinking, you know what, we do these examples in class, or in my real life, I'm experiencing these different situations, and I just feel like every time only one approach kind of surfaces, then odds are you might be a little bit stuck, right? With that in mind, there are some things that we can think about as to why that might be the case and then what we can do about it. A lot of times, the reason why people get stuck using certain habits is, of course, it's what feels most comfortable. And one explanation for that stems from social learning theory and what you learned as a child, right? And what kind of communication skills you developed within your own family interactions. What behaviors were reinforced and what behaviors either you weren't given the opportunity to practice or maybe came with consequences. We know that behaviors that get positively reinforced and behaviors that get practiced are the ones that tend to stick. So if you lived in a household that involved lots of conversation and discussion and participation in conflict with positive outcomes, then you probably are someone who is going to fit into one of those categories that has a preference for engaging in conflict, whether that's dominating or integrating or compromising. On the other hand, when you were young, if you were kind of taught to do anything you could to not have to get involved in a conflict, or maybe you watched your family members engage in conflict and experience lots of negative outcomes, then you probably are more likely to have developed a style that fits into that avoiding category, whether that's obliging or avoiding or what have you. People that are particularly effective communicators, especially when it comes to conflict, have this label of being rhetorically sensitive. It's certainly easier said than done, but rhetorical sensitivity is the idea that people can change or at least kind of modify their communication styles depending on the nature of the situation. And again, it's easier said than done, but we know ways to help increase rhetorical sensitivity in large part come with awareness, right? Taking classes like this, having conversations where, first of all, we identify what our preferences are, then we talk about pros and cons associated with those preferences, and then we become more aware of other potential preferences or other potential behaviors. So awareness is certainly, a great first step, right? In addition to that, stepping out of our comfort zones and practicing other styles and kind of thinking about and feeling what that's like is also another way to kind of help improve our rhetorical sensitivity. Certainly I can appreciate how that's easier said than done, but it's still important. Okay. And even things like we do in class regarding role plays, right, where the stakes are pretty low and the risk is pretty low. Engaging in these types of role plays can help us to kind of get unstuck from our conflict style and engage in some perspective taking and hopefully kind of increase some of that rhetorical sensitivity. All right. So at this point, I talked kind of quickly through that lecture. Not that I often talk kind of quickly during lectures, but I had a lot of content that I wanted to get through. So hopefully at this point, though, you are feeling comfortable identifying those 5 conflict styles. If you haven't already, at this point, go back and assess your conflict style, or at least your top preference or 2, so you can talk about that in our next class section. And then hopefully also you're now kind of thinking a little bit more about some of the pros and cons or advantages and disadvantages among all the different styles. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out.